Welcome to our webinar. My name is Richard Greaves and I'm Deputy Director of Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. And I'm here with my colleague Vasily Astrov. He is the author of our Autumn Forecast Report. He is our Russia expert and in general, I would say a very good CIS and Ukraine expert. And he will be doing the main presentation today. Just a couple of words of introduction from me before we start. We live, I think it's a rather obvious statement, but we live in very interesting times, and the volume of news and also economically relevant news is a bit overwhelming at times. And Vasily has, I think, a very unenviable task today to try to present a story about the region in a reasonably concise way. So the idea is that Vasily will talk for between 25 minutes and half an hour, giving our main views on the region. But of course, this can only be an overview and the general story. And there are many more details then which will follow on from that. So Vasily will present, but then we will have a discussion round. When we started these webinars, doing them in English like this, we used to have about 30 people coming, maybe 35 people, and they would last, up to an hour. That's also the plan for today, but we have a lot more people attending these days. And so, we may in the end have to go a bit over the hour, and that's if there are more questions, and that's okay from our side. I also wanted to say, so Vasily and I are here and you can see us, but a lot of our country experts are also here listening. And if you have country specific questions in the question round, we can also bring them in, those that are here to help us to answer the questions as well. Before we start, just some very basic housekeeping. Nobody can speak apart from us, so if you speak, we cannot hear you, but please write your comments in the box. There's a chat function on the right. I see a couple of people have already written a message in there. Please write. You can write as we go along. You don't have to wait until the end. I will collect them and we will get through. I cannot promise every single question, but we will get through as many as we can. So that's it from me. I will now hand over to Vasily, who will give the main presentation.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, so ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our press conference in these very challenging times. So I would like to give a brief overview of economic developments in countries of Central, East, and Southeast Europe. So first of all, I will talk about the past developments, in particular, what were the developments in Eastern Europe during the first wave of the coronavirus pandemic, what was the impact on the individual sectors and individual demand components of GDP. Then I will talk a bit about the policy response, both on the fiscal and on the monetary side, and also about the impact of the implemented measure on the labor markets, which is very important, of course. And finally, in the final section of my presentation, I will talk about the forecasts, our estimates for this year, and our forecast, our medium-term forecast for next year and for 2022. So first of all, about the health developments, about the coronavirus developments, what have been the developments in Eastern Europe. I will say Eastern Europe just to make it short. I will not say every time Central, East, and Southeastern Europe. So if you look at this chart shows the number of deaths linked to COVID-19 per 1 million of population. These are cumulated deaths up until the 10th of November. Excuse me. So this is very recent data, very, very fresh data. And here on the left-hand side, you see the West European countries. And on the right-hand side, you see the countries of Eastern Europe. And here the message is that East European countries has been generally less affected by the coronavirus pandemic, at least so far. So these horizontal blue lines, they correspond to regional averages. Yeah. So you have the regional average for Western Europe on the left-hand side and for Eastern Europe on the right-hand side. And you see that by and large, countries of Eastern Europe were affected less by the pandemic so far. Even countries such as North Macedonia and Montenegro, you see these are the countries in the East European region which recorded the highest number of deaths per 1 million of population. Even these countries, they still find themselves in a better position than, for instance, France, Italy, UK, or Spain, or let alone Belgium. So far the health impact has been somewhat smaller. However, the governments of East European countries were generally quite quick in reacting to the first wave of the pandemic. In March, April of this year, they implemented, on most of them, implemented strict lockdowns, similarly to what the West European countries did, West European governments did. And these lockdowns were generally as strict as those implemented in Western Europe, and they were also rather long, or similarly long, and in some cases even longer than in Western Europe. And from this point of view, it is interesting to see that despite the fact that the lockdowns were actually quite strict and rather lengthy, the economic impact of the pandemic, of the first wave of the pandemic in Eastern Europe was not as bad as in Western Europe. So in this chart, you see the decline in real GDP in the second quarter of this year, which more or less corresponds to the time of the lockdown. So a large part of the second quarter actually was covered by lockdowns. And here you see the performance of individual economies, individual East European economies in the second quarter. So these dark blue bars pointing downwards, this shows the extent of the recession, real GDP recession recorded in the second quarter. And here you can also compare this performance to the euro area average, which is this horizontal line, this orange horizontal line, and also to Austria, in case you're interested. So this red bar on the very right-hand side, this is Austria. And you can see that by and large, countries of Eastern Europe, they had smaller losses in the second quarter. They had smaller losses under the first wave of the coronavirus pandemic than the euro average. Yeah? But at the same time, you can also see a lot of variation across individual East European countries. And here, if you concentrate on the left-hand side of this chart, you can basically distinguish two groups of countries in Eastern Europe which were affected the worst in the second quarter, which were affected the worst under the first wave of the pandemic. So at the very left extreme of the chart, you see Montenegro and Croatia. You can see that the real GDP in Montenegro was particularly sharp. It was much sharper than in the euro area average. And in Croatia, it was similarly sharp as in the euro area average. And there is a reason for that. These two countries are strongly dependent on tourism. Tourism is a very important part of the economy. And tourism, of course, suffered a lot during the pandemic. For instance, in Croatia, the tourist arrivals plunged by about 60% in the first 7 months of this year, and in Montenegro by nearly 80%. So this basically explains why these countries perform so badly. Why tourist arrivals plunged so much? This is for pretty obvious reasons: closed borders, the reluctance to travel under the first wave of the pandemic. So the reasons are pretty clear. But there is also a second group of countries which is also to be found primarily on the left-hand side of this chart. These are the smaller Visegrad countries: Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, and also Slovenia. These are small open economies which are highly dependent on foreign trade, and they are highly integrated in regional value chains, in particular with Germany, and in particular as far as the car industry is concerned. And the car industry didn't have a good time in the second quarter. There was a demand shock because the demand for cars collapsed on the one hand, and on the other hand, there were also supply interruptions within the framework of these international value chains. So there was a strong shock on this side, on the external side, and this explains basically why these countries, the smaller Visegrad countries and Slovenia, they suffered over proportionately in the second quarter. Yeah, and on the other hand, if you concentrate now on the very right-hand side of this chart, so the last blue bar on the extreme right-hand side, pointing downwards, this is Belarus. You see that in the second quarter, Belarus was the East European country which performed the best. Why is that? Why was it the case? The reason is that Belarus, unlike other East European countries, never implemented a lockdown. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko openly questioned the existence of the coronavirus, even if he contracted it himself in the end. But there was no lockdown, and you see the economic consequences of that. So actually, the economy performed better than in other countries of the region. Now, I mentioned that by and large, the economies of Eastern Europe performed better than Western Europe in the first wave of the pandemic. Why was that the case? I don't think there is a uniform answer, or this question can be answered very easily. But I think one factor which certainly played a role, and which I would like to point out here in this chart, is the structural factor. That is basically the fact that the services sector in East European countries is not as important on average as it is in Western Europe. So here you see in this chart, you see the share of value added in services in GDP in percent. And again, you have West European countries on the left-hand side and East European countries on the right-hand side. And you also have the EU average, which is this orange, the horizontal line, which corresponds to the EU average. And you can see that all East European countries are below the EU average. Yeah? And many of the West European countries are above, logically. Why is it important? It's important because it was the services sector which was hit the most by the pandemic. So the fact that the economies of Eastern Europe are less dependent on services on average played to their advantage in this case. So that is one of the reasons why the extent of economic decline was not as strong as in Western Europe. Now, if one looks at individual demand components of GDP, one can see, or one can basically say, that it was above all the domestic demand which took the main hit under the first wave of the pandemic. And what I would like to show you here, these are our estimates and projections for GDP growth for this year, for next year, and for 2022. So these three bars for every country, they correspond to the 3 years, respectively, 2020, 2021, and 2022. And our GDP projections, or our GDP estimates, they correspond to these black stars. That is one thing. And another thing, that apart from the growth itself, we also estimate the development and the contributions of individual demand components: household consumption, investments, net exports, change in inventories, government consumption. So these are the main components of GDP on the demand side. And here I do not show all the countries of our region. We cover 23 countries in total, so it's difficult really to present this in one slide, and probably that would be too much. So here we selected a few countries which are maybe the biggest economy or the biggest economies or the most important economies in each sub-region of Eastern Europe. So we have Poland, which is the biggest economy in Central Europe. We have Serbia, which is the biggest economy in the Western Balkans. We have Russia, which is the biggest economy in the CIS. And we also have Turkey, which is, of course, also a big country and a big economy. And also for comparison purposes, we have here Slovakia and Croatia. I would like to mention later why I chose these two countries, why I added these two countries in addition. So if you look at the performance or at the dynamics of individual demand components, you will see that it is basically two demand components which contributed or which are expected to contribute the most to GDP recessions this year. So this is this orange bar, or the orange part of the bar, which is private consumption or household consumption, and the dark blue bar, which is gross fixed capital formation. You can see that both components are in negative territory and are the main drag on GDP growth in the countries, in most countries presented in this chart. Why is that so? Well, as far as the private consumption is concerned, of course, one reason for this is that simply the fact that the supply of many goods and services was administratively restricted during the first wave of the pandemic. So people simply couldn't purchase goods and services that they wanted. This is a pretty obvious reason. Another reason is that also the demand for durable consumer goods suffered because of the high uncertainties. The high uncertainties also played a role for the dynamics of investments, also for pretty obvious reasons. And finally, as far as investments are concerned, also the reduced levels of capacity utilization. Yeah? The fact that the capacities were utilized less, of course, gave little incentive to businesses to invest into the expansion of their production capacities. So that is the reason why both consumption and investments have been in deep red in most countries of the region. But you also see here two countries which I added in addition, as I said, Slovakia and Croatia. And in Croatia, you see Croatia is a bit of a special case because in Croatia, you see that the main factor which was driving recession, or which has been driving recession this year, that is net exports. And the reason for that I already mentioned. This is the reliance on tourism. These are basically services exports, which suffered very strongly. So in the case of Croatia, this very strong negative contribution of net exports added to the strong contraction of domestic demand, and that is also the reason why the recession in Croatia has been so deep this year. In Slovakia, that is also a bit similar, with the only difference is that in Slovakia it was also the external demand shock. Only in Slovakia it is not tourism, it is basically the car industry. I already mentioned that earlier. So in countries which are strongly dependent on tourism and foreign trade, recession has been basically deeper because in addition to the slump in domestic demand, there was also a strong external demand shock. Now, if we talk about the fiscal implications of the crisis, of course, what you see here is that basically the budget deficits have risen very strongly everywhere in the region, which is, of course, a normal development during a crisis. So in this chart, you see these dark blue bars, which correspond to the estimated increase in the budget deficit this year compared to last year in percentage points of GDP. So you see that basically everywhere there is a very strong increase in budget deficits. And of course, you have two reasons for this increase in budget deficits. On the one hand, there is a shortfall in tax revenues because of the recession. That is one reason. And the second reason is the expansionary fiscal policy. So all these countries, similarly to Western Europe, responded with a marked relaxation of fiscal policy. And we tried to estimate the extent of this fiscal stimulus. Our country experts did estimates of that. And this is what is represented by the light gray bars in this chart. Yeah, and you can see that in most cases, actually the rise in the budget deficit has been driven by these fiscal policy stimulus measures. I would like to point out that in some cases, if you look at the left-hand side of this chart, you will see that in some cases these light gray bars are very high and they actually exceed the estimated increase in the budget deficits. You may ask, how is this possible? This is possible because in some countries, not all, or actually in many countries, not all fiscal measures which are contained in the fiscal packages, in the announced fiscal packages, will actually result in payments in government expenditures. For instance, you have items such as credit guarantees. They do not necessarily result in payments depending on the situation, or they result only partly. So this explains why countries such as, for instance, Slovenia or Croatia, they have very high they have a very high size of fiscal packages, which you see here in this chart. Of course, there has been a very wide range of fiscal measures adopted. There were hikes in unemployment benefits, in child benefits, tax deferrals, subsidized credit, and so on. I would like to focus on one particular measure, which has been very important for the situation in the labor markets. These are the short-time work schemes. All EU member states have implemented such short-time work schemes, West Balkan countries and also Turkey. So actually most countries of the East European region implemented such short-time work schemes. So the idea here is the following, that instead of firing people, instead of firing employees, managers send them into short-time arrangements, short-time working arrangements. So people work less. They also receive less money. They receive in the case of EU member states, they receive between 50 and 80% of their previous wage or salary. And this is subsidized by the governments. So this is the idea, and the idea behind is to keep as many jobs as possible, to prevent an increase in unemployment. And indeed, if you look at this chart, you will see that these schemes have been very successful. So we have data on the number of jobs and on the number of working hours for the second quarter of this year. And here we have a growth rate on an annual basis in the second quarter of this year of these two indicators for the EU member states. Unfortunately, we don't have data on the working hours for the West Balkan countries, CIS and Turkey, so we cannot really compare the situation with the number of jobs and the number of working hours, but we can do it for the EU member states. And this is what you see on the left-hand side of this chart. So these gray bars, this was the reduction of jobs, the number of jobs in the second quarter, and the orange bars were the reductions of working hours. So you see that the reduction of working hours was much, much stronger than the reduction of employment. And so the main reason for that was these short-time work schemes, which proved effective in limiting the decline in employment and consequently the rise in unemployment. So there was some increase in unemployment during the crisis, which is unavoidable, but it was not very dramatic. So it was about 1 or 2 percentage points, at maximum 3 percentage points, which is actually not that bad given the circumstances. So this was a very important measure. On the monetary policy side, there was also a response. So in those countries which still have monetary policy autonomy, which are on flexible exchange rates, the policy rates have been cut markedly, as you see, basically everywhere. And basically the idea behind monetary policy easing, behind excuse me, behind cutting the interest rates was twofold. Or theoretically, there are two transmission mechanisms which can help to boost the economy by relaxing monetary policy. On the one hand, the idea is to stimulate credit demand via lower interest rates, and this has not worked very well, I must say. So if you look at the performance of credit expansion in East European countries, it hardly picked up, with the only exception of Turkey. So Turkey has been a very big exception to this, but by and large there was no revival in credit, probably because of the high uncertainties. So households and businesses were not too happy to take credit under the conditions of high uncertainty. But that is only one transmission channel, which didn't work very well. The second transmission channel of monetary policy easing, that is the exchange rate. So basically, thanks to the lower interest rates, there have been less capital inflows or maybe capital outflows from East European countries, and this has contributed to currency depreciations. So you can see that the countries with, or the economies with a flexible exchange rate regime, they have depreciated over the past 10 months. Their currencies have depreciated over the past 10 months. These depreciations have been relatively contained in the case of Visegrad countries, Romania, Albania, and Serbia, which are on the left-hand side of this chart. But if you look at the right-hand side of this chart, you will see countries of the CIS, Ukraine, and Turkey. And here you will see that the currency depreciations have been rather strong. And especially in the case of Russia, Belarus, and Turkey, the depreciations have been to the tune of 20% or even exceeding 20% against the euro since the start of the year. So these are pretty sizable depreciations, and these depreciations have helped to preserve, or at least to mitigate, the extent of the demand, of the external demand shocks by boosting the competitiveness of the economies. So this was the second transmission mechanism of monetary policy easing, which has played a role, although one has to say that it was not the only reason behind currency depreciations. There were also other country-specific reasons, above all, which I can mention later on. And finally, I'm coming to the last section of my presentation, the last part of my presentation. These are our forecasts. And of course, the forecasts are now surrounded by very huge uncertainties, which is understandable. And many of the factors which underlie these uncertainties, they are of medical nature, they are not of economic nature. And this is, of course, something that is difficult for us to assess because we are not health experts. But one thing is pretty sure, is pretty clear, that is the fact that the fourth quarter of this year will be bad. Why is that? Of course, the reason is pretty clear. The COVID cases have been on the rise again recently. So the second wave of the pandemic. This chart shows the dynamics of COVID cases per 100,000 of population over the last 14 days. And again, I do not present here all the countries of our region, but just the most important, so to say, countries or the biggest economies from each sub-region of Eastern Europe: Poland, Russia, Serbia, and Turkey. And you see that in some countries, such as in Poland and Serbia, basically what we have been observing recently was the exponential growth of coronavirus cases. And these developments are rather typical also for many other countries, especially in Central Europe, but also in the Western Balkans. And this also has, of course, economic implications, because the high number of cases and the high number of hospitalizations tests the capacity of the healthcare system to cope. And these limits of the healthcare system prompt the governments to reimpose lockdowns. And you probably know that this has already happened in many countries. So many countries from the region, especially from Central Europe, have reintroduced lockdowns. So they are now under second lockdowns, either full or partial. Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Hungary, Serbia, Latvia, Lithuania. Maybe I forgot some countries, but these are already countries which are which are under lockdown one way or another. These lockdowns so far have been not as strict as those imposed in spring, but still they are enough to push economies into recession. And that's why we estimate that this year there will be double-dip recessions in basically almost everywhere in East European countries. We also think that many countries which have not imposed yet a lockdown will follow suit soon, because of the dynamics is really pretty bad almost everywhere. So that means that there was a recession in the second quarter, and we think there will be another recession in the fourth quarter. And that's why we think that for the year as a whole, for 2020 as a whole, there will be a double-dip recession. Now, if we look into the future, if we look into next year and 2022, then we can only work with scenarios. Yeah, and we have the so-called baseline scenario, which is benign. We call it a benign scenario. Why is it benign? Because it crucially assumes that next year there will be an effective vaccine against coronavirus. Why is it important? Because it will be able, or it will succeed in containing the pandemic without the need to resort to lengthy lockdowns, which are, of course, very painful for the economy. And in this benign baseline scenario, excuse me, we project that most countries, or nearly all countries of Eastern Europe, will grow next year and also in 2022. So this is the table with our forecasts, with our growth forecasts. You can see the heat map. So basically everything that is green or yellow, that is in the positive territory. So you see that for next year, for instance, we expect positive growth nearly everywhere, with the exception of Belarus. So in the baseline scenario, Belarus is the only East European country for which we expect another recession next year. And this is because of the economic fallout from the current political crisis in Belarus. But in all other countries, we expect a recovery. However, this recovery will be not as strong as the recession which we estimate for this year. And that means that the economic losses incurred this year will not be completely offset next year. That means that most countries of the region will reach pre-crisis levels of economic activity. That means the levels recorded in 2019 only in 2022 at the earliest. The only exceptions to these are Turkey, Serbia, and Lithuania. So we think that for these three countries, it is plausible that these countries, that economic growth in these three countries will be high enough next year to compensate for the losses of this year. Now, I would like to stress once again that these are our projections for the benign baseline scenario. And of course, there are strong downward risks to this benign scenario. And I would like to emphasize in particular two risks. One risk is pretty obvious, that is the uncontrolled spread of the pandemic. So if there is no effective vaccine, if the spread of the coronavirus continues, there will be little choice for governments but to impose renewed lockdowns, and this will again drive economies into recessions. If you look at the previous track record, then the relationship between the stringency of imposed coronavirus measures and the extent of economic downturn has been pretty strong. So that is one risk. But there is also another risk, which we think is also very important, that is the risk related to the continuation of government support measures. We think that the continuation of government support measures is important even in the baseline scenario, because it is conceivable that, for instance, depressed demand for certain types of services, such as recreation, aviation, hospitality, and so on, will remain depressed, even in the benign baseline scenario, basically due to psychological scars from the pandemic. And that means that many businesses in these sectors will continue to depend on government support. So the government support will be crucial, at least for some time. And here it basically hinges on the issue of available policy space. We think that in the EU member states, the availability of fiscal policy space is not really an issue, or will not be an issue. These countries have generally little problems to borrow, or these governments have generally little problems to borrow money in the markets due to their relatively good credit ratings. And also I would like to stress that EU member states will also receive strong support from the European Union under this so-called Next Generation EU program. And the key ingredient of this program is the so-called EU Recovery and Resilience Facility. And there are already planned allocations for individual countries, these in the form of grants for individual EU countries. And in this chart, you see that most of the East European countries are actually located on the left-hand side of this chart, meaning that the funds that they are expected to receive from the European Union are rather high in relation to their GDP. So if you divide it by individual years, then for instance, in the case of Croatia and Bulgaria, which are located on the extreme left-hand side of this chart, you can see that the expected funds next year and in 2022, will be to the tune of about 3% of their GDP, or even exceeding 3% of their GDP, which is, of course, or which will be a very strong support for these countries. But in other countries, such as in some Western Balkan countries, Ukraine or Moldova, the fiscal policy space is maybe a problem, because some of these countries already have very high public debt to GDP ratios, for instance, Albania and Montenegro. Some countries are strongly dependent on external assistance from the IMF or from the World Bank, or sometimes from Russia, such as, for instance, Belarus. And in these cases, it is questionable whether the continuation of government measures will be possible to the extent that it exists now. Yeah? And such government policy measures may be even more necessary in the case of uncontrolled spread of the pandemic. But the fiscal space may be an issue. And if the scenario of a premature withdrawal of government support is realized, this will, of course, result, or most likely result, in a new wave of bankruptcies, in the rise of unemployment, in losses of household incomes, and this will, of course, weigh heavily on the economies. So these are the two main risks which we see at the moment. So at the very end, I would like to show you again our slide our projections, our estimates for this year and our projections for the next 2 years. And I am very happy to answer your questions. And I think also the country experts, which are also attending this webinar, will be also happy to answer your questions. So thank you very much.
Comprehensive overview of what's going on in the region. I think you make the case that in the first wave, the region did pretty well relatively compared to Western Europe, and in many cases handled it pretty well. But the winter is going to be tough, and it's definitely not a time for complacency, and especially for the non-EU member states of the region, which do not have this huge fiscal support and other advantages as well. It's going to be certainly a challenging few months before the full recovery hopefully takes hold next year. Ronnie, I can see, has just put the presentation slides in the handout section on the right, so you can all download that already if you want to. And he is also going to put the report in there as well, so you can also read that afterwards if you want to. I'll get to the questions now because we already have quite a few, which is great. We're very happy to have that. I saw already that a couple of questions have been answered by my colleagues. So there was one on inventory changes methodology, which Alexandra has answered. Thank you for that. There was one on the labor market support, specifically for Croatia, which Sebastian has answered. So thank you for that. But I think we might come back to you, Sebastian, for a bit more on the labor market later on. But let's start with the first couple of questions were about growth composition and partly the role of inventories in this on the chart that you showed, and also of net exports and how they're positive even this year in the case of Poland. So maybe you could say, Vasily, I mean, is there anything general to say about this, or is it very country specific, do you think, about the growth composition for, well, this year for the downturn, but also for the recovery?
So actually, there is a chart where you can see I will show you, there are contributions to GDP growth actually for all countries of our region. Yeah. So because of course, we did these estimates for all countries and projections for all countries. So in this chart, you see all EU member states from from Eastern Europe. And what you can see here is basically that for these Central European countries, what I said is basically correct for most countries. It was above all the domestic demand which took the main hit. I already pointed out that Croatia is a big exception. In countries such as, for instance, Slovakia and Romania, the role of net exports is also relatively big. So net exports also aggravate the situation. This is this light gray part of the bar. If you look at the change in inventories, then yeah, in many cases it has been also negative. So basically the inventories have been depleted, which is probably a rational response on the crisis conditions to deplete inventories. So on top of the falling fixed capital formation, you also have a depletion of inventories. And now if you look at the other sub-regions of Eastern Europe, here you see the Western Balkans on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side you see the CIS countries, Ukraine and Turkey. And you see here that, for instance, in the case of the Western Balkans, the situation is a bit different. So actually here, you also have a strong contraction of domestic demand. This is similar as in Central Europe. But here you see several cases where the contribution of real net exports of goods and services to GDP growth has been actually positive this year. Yeah. So you see in Bosnia, in Montenegro, in North Macedonia, in Serbia, we estimate that and these estimates are based, of course, to a large extent on the data that we already have for the first 2 quarters of this year. You can see that the contribution of net exports is positive, and that is, of course, due to the fact that imports contracted even more than exports. So that is the reason why the contribution of net exports is positive. In the CIS countries, well, this is a mixed picture. You can see that, for instance, in Ukraine, also in Moldova, the contributions of net exports are positive. For instance, in Ukraine, the reason is that agricultural exports have performed pretty well, because agricultural items and food, this is the most important export item, and this was not very strongly affected by the first wave of the pandemic. But as you see, the picture here really is mixed. In Turkey, for instance, the net exports also contributed negatively to, or are estimated to contribute negatively to GDP growth. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Vasily. I think the next question is a very good one from Birgit, but I'm not sure if we can answer it, unfortunately. So the question is about the share of direct fiscal measures which are really dispersed. And I think, Vasily showed the chart of fiscal plans pledged and then the deficit. And you see in many cases the fiscal pledge is bigger than the deficit, which at first sight doesn't make sense. But I think that speaks, so especially in Southeast Europe, I think that speaks to our skepticism, which I think is also very strongly implied in your question. But this is, of course, something we can only know later when we get the full data. But I think it's a good question, and we have to measure this when we have the data to check it. I'm not sure. What do you think, Vasily? You're muted, I think.
With, of course, these fiscal measures may be not so easy to quantify, because it doesn't only depend on the funds which are earmarked by the government. Yeah. So this is one thing. That is the easy part. Yeah. The funds that the government announced will be available for the fiscal policy measures is one thing, but another thing is that it is also dependent on the absorption rate. So, for instance, if you take the short-time work schemes, then actually the amounts disbursed are not only dependent on the government, but it's also dependent on whether there is demand for these short-time work schemes. Just to give an example, yeah. And with respect to, for instance, credit guarantees, it may be even more difficult, yeah, because credit guarantees, if these are only guarantees, yeah. So if everything goes well, there is no need for the government to jump in. If things go really bad, that maybe the government needs to take over a large part of the liabilities of the private sector, yeah, especially of the systemic of big companies which are too big to fail. So yes, I think this is not an easy task, and our country experts, I think they did their best to try to estimate the size of the fiscal measures to the extent possible.
Okay, the next question changes the conversation quite a bit. It's a very interesting question from Claire. As well as the pandemic, there have been geopolitical issues and trade wars and geoeconomics, I guess. Given the change in the president of the US, which we know matters for all of us, could that have positive consequences for our region, especially the export-oriented economies of Central Europe? I can start, and then you can add if you think I miss it.
Okay.
I mean,
okay.
I agree that it's very important. I think the change of president in the US is very important for this region for lots of reasons, actually. I mean, my sense was this was probably Trump's policy on China, trade policy on China was probably the area where he had the most bipartisan support. I didn't feel ever that much resistance from the Democrats on this. And I think in general, he's moved the debate on China in the US, and it's going to be very hard to go back to how it was. It's true that Biden's language has been quite conciliatory so far towards China, which is interesting, I think. But I'm still very cautious or, skeptical really about how much is fundamentally going to change. I think this idea has taken hold in the US that China is undercutting the US, it's stealing ideas from the US, etc., etc. So I think the idea of going back to the US leading this, open globalized world in economic terms, I don't think that's coming back. I would also say that for Central Europe, the growth model was in a way under pressure anyway, with the structural change in the automotive industry, all the challenges of the German automotive industry of the last few years. And then this trade war was just another thing. And I think it exposes the extreme export reliance, extreme openness of especially the three smaller Visegrad countries. And so I think that there will probably be a change in tone in the US. This is, net positive for these small open economies, but I think that basically it's still a pretty challenging situation for them, and it will be at least during this forecast period. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Vasily.
I think it is conceivable that the administration of Joe Biden will be a little bit more interested in what's going on in Europe than the administration of President Trump, because really President Trump was pretty much isolationist, yeah. And to the extent that he was interested in the outside world, he was really focusing, as Richard said, very much on China as the biggest threat, especially economic threat to the United States. Europe, I don't think that this was really a priority for him. Yeah, it is conceivable that for Biden it will be different, especially Biden when he was vice president under Obama. He was preoccupied with foreign policy most of his time, I think. Yeah, that was really there was a very important part of his portfolio. Maybe he did even more in some ways than State Secretary Clinton. And yeah, so there will be more interest in Europe, I think. There will be probably more interest in countries such as Ukraine, which are seen, of course, as an area of geopolitical rivalry with Russia. I know that Russia is not very happy with Joe Biden, but on the other hand, Russia was also disappointed with President Trump. They had a lot of expectations that there will be a change for the better, but it didn't materialize. So in the end, I think Russia was also pretty indifferent, because they think that no matter who becomes the president of the United States, it really doesn't matter very much, as long as the bulk of the political establishment is very much anti-Russian. So this really doesn't make a difference. So yes, that would be my additions to your question.
Thanks, Vasily. We have actually a few questions which sort of go towards geoeconomics or the impact of political events on economics. So I think it's best if we go through those together. So the next one is about Brexit, which I have to say I've kind of forgotten about. But it's back, of course. So the negotiations are in the final stage again. It's a kind of Groundhog Day. It's unclear whether they'll be successful. That's very true. What would Brexit, and I guess especially no-deal Brexit, mean for Central and Eastern Europe? And here we're probably talking about the same countries as well. At least two would be most directly affected. I mean, I think, if you go back to before this pandemic, all these studies about how Brexit will wipe out 0.7% of EU GDP, I mean, it seems kind of ridiculous now. It's in the context of what the pandemic's done, it's so minor, Brexit, in its economic effects. Even if you believe, those projections from before the pandemic. I mean, and this has also been a huge stress test, a huge shock test, really, for the durability of supply chains under the most extreme stress scenario, and a much more extreme, I think, than anything Brexit can deliver. And we saw in the second quarter supply chains completely broke down for a while. And we saw that exactly countries like Czech Republic or Hungary were extremely badly affected by this. But I think what's pretty encouraging is how quickly it bounced back. Of course, there's a demand shock, which is still with us and will remain with us for some time. But the supply shock was very brief, actually. It was really confined to the second quarter. And I think it's very impressive how quickly supply chains were rebuilt and industry came back online. I think that part is pretty encouraging when we think about Brexit as well. I mean, if there's a no-deal Brexit, and it's looking relatively likely again, unfortunately, it will definitely be a negative economic hit, and it will, of course, affect more the countries that are most open, most trade dependent, especially tied into Germany, which will be first in line for the negative Brexit hit. So that's exactly in Visegrad countries, Slovenia, Romania. But I think that whatever happens, it is not going to feel as bad as it could have, considering what we've been through this year. And in the end, it's in the context of the pandemic, it is not a major economic story. It's a major political story, of course, but I think the fallout should be fairly manageable. That's my sense. The next question, which comes back again, so to includes Russia, so also for of course for you, Vasily, is what about Chinese and Russian influence in Southeast Europe? And I think we probably want to focus on economic influence or geoeconomics in Southeast Europe, and also on the war between Nagorno-Karabakh war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and how that impacts on the region's economies and especially Turkey. So you can start, and then I can take over.
The Chinese influence in Southeastern Europe is big, especially within the framework of the Belt and Road initiative. So basically, China has seen Southeastern Europe, the Balkan countries, as an important transit corridor for its Belt and Road initiative, and has implemented some projects in economic terms. The Russian influence is not as strong. The Russian influence is fairly strong in Serbia due to historical ties, cultural ties. Serbia is a neutral country, and that the majority of Europe is already in NATO. So Serbia is an important asset for Russia in Europe, as a relatively friendly country. But other than that, the economic influence of Russia is not very strong in Southeastern Europe. When it comes to Nagorno-Karabakh, the impact on the impact of the conflict on the countries that we cover, the economic impact is not big. This Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, of course, it has certain political repercussions on the role of Russia, on the role of Turkey, especially these two countries. And actually, in our latest monthly report, we have an article by a renowned expert in international relations who is analyzing these issues in detail. So basically, how this conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh has changed or is contributing to changes in the relative positions of individual countries, their geopolitical standing. For Russia, I think actually the resolution of the war, so this peace agreement that was signed the other day between Armenia and Azerbaijan, is probably an asset, because Russian troops will be now controlling the large parts of the Nagorno-Karabakh. So the presence of Russia will rise in the region. What are the economic implications of this? I think there are no economic implications. It's just about geopolitics in this case. For Turkey, of course, Turkey was the country which openly supported Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan has won this war. So Azerbaijan negotiated this ceasefire agreement from the position of strength after military defeats. So for Turkey, it's also an increase in influence in the region, as far as I can see. But maybe my colleague Richard, who is our Turkey expert, can add more on that.
Yeah, thanks, Vasily. I mean, just to touch on the first point briefly, so I fully agree. I think the real story in Southeast Europe is China. I mean, this links to the question about the US. You know, the US has withdrawn from Europe over many years. It may be exaggerated by Donald Trump, it may be downplayed by Biden, but the US is oriented more and more towards China and Asia, and that's, I think, been clear for a long time. And there is this vacuum in Southeast Europe, security vacuum, or more than there used to be. And various people have stepped into that, but I think in an economic sense, the real story is China. And it is a competitor to the EU in this region more and more. It's something I think the EU should take more seriously, actually. And I think this is going to be more and more of a story in the coming years, irrespective of the pandemic. I can say more about Turkey. I mean, this war is certainly like Vasily said, it's a geopolitical victory for Turkey. You know, Turkey has been pursuing a much more active foreign policy in the last few years. It has what it sees as its sphere of influence. It has stepped outside of that in a way in this conflict quite decisively, more into, you know, it's the former Soviet Union. It's more, you know, Russia's traditional sphere of influence, and won in a military sense. And it, you know, it's very popular in Turkey, and it's geopolitically very significant. But I think what it has shown, and the message has hit home for sure in Ankara as well, is that they cannot pursue this kind of foreign policy with such a weak economic flank, especially at a time when the leadership of the US is changing. So with these big external financing needs, short-term in dollars, having to go constantly to the dollar market, they've been threatened with US sanctions for years. Donald Trump seems to have blocked that. He's now going. It makes Turkey a lot more vulnerable, I think, to economic pressure from the US. And we saw over the weekend, you know, which comes along with the Nagorno-Karabakh resolution, but I think is much more linked to the election cycle in the US. Apparent complete change of economic policy in Turkey, change at the central bank, change at the finance ministry, promise from the president of much more orthodox monetary policy, higher rates, defending the lira. I think this all speaks to the sense of, okay, geopolitically, this is a win. Geopolitically, Turkey wants to flex its muscles more, but it cannot do that without addressing these very open economic vulnerabilities that it has. And that, I think, is, in a way, even more significant development of the last few days. Well, the next question is on Bosnia. So our colleague Branimir is here, and I would like to bring him in if possible. And I think, you know, so it's from Matthias about the second IMF deal potentially for Bosnia. But do we think in general the IMF will roll out more across the region? Because we've seen the IMF very active in Southeast Europe, right from, you know, I think the role's been very important and positive. And especially in the Western Balkans, I would say. So Branimir, maybe you want to say something on this. I can see that Branimir is here, but I can't hear him yet. It sometimes takes a few seconds. I mean, I think one thing that, while we wait for Branimir, one thing that's been interesting in this crisis, I think, is the amount of emergency support in the Western Balkans and the speed with which it arrived compared to last time, to the 2008 crisis. I think it's very positive. It's helped stability a lot in the region. And here is Branimir now. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Sorry, some technical problems. Yeah, so the IMF the loan about Bosnia. So first about Bosnia. Yes, there are some talks about that at the moment, but the real issue with Bosnia is not finding money, or let's say the fiscal space, but the real issue there is disbursing the money or spending the money, because the government was pretty bad in that sense. So the enactment of the support package, of the fiscal package, in the second quarter was pretty bad there, one of the worst, one of the lowest in the whole region. And that's because of the complicated governance structure there. They have so many levels of governments, and everything goes very slowly there. So I think that if we speak about Bosnia, that's the real issue there. It's not how to find the money, it's how to spend the money. Then again, on the IMF, let's say, support for the whole region in general, yes, I agree that the IMF has space, or can afford to offer I'm not sure that there's political will to do that. At least I don't see a will for giving a support which will be, let's say, enough for all the needs that these countries have. And I'll give just an example from North Macedonia. So the IMF gave, let's say, North Macedonia around 200 million euros in the spring through this rapid financial instrument. But that was not enough to cover the needs that the country had. So the country had to borrow again on the international markets, and it issued a euro bond of 700 million, so 3 times or 4 times more than the IMF loan. So basically, as the IMF can step in and can provide some money, but I don't think that it will cover all the needs that these countries have.
Thank you, Branimir, very much. While you're here, we have a couple of other questions which I think speak at least partly to the Western Balkans. So there's a question from Craig, which I think is a very important part of this whole thing, about government support and government intervention in this crisis. So the EBRD suggested this week it may not always be welcome. It could be used to increase state control of business, or I guess state capture in general. But is this a risk that we need to take in order to save jobs? And it doesn't say that this question specifically about the Western Balkans, but when this is discussed, this issue is often discussed in relation to the Western Balkans. So maybe you have some thoughts on that as well.
So I think we shouldn't worry about this. And the main indicator here, apart from, let's say, macroeconomics, is that if you look, if you talk to the businessmen or the chambers in the Western Balkans, they are the first to ask for government support. So they don't, if they are not afraid, let's say, that the government might control them, I think we shouldn't worry either. And also from a macroeconomic perspective, I think that's a risk that you have to take anyway at this point of time, because everybody currently is suggesting that governments must step in and must provide sizable fiscal support in order to survive the crisis. And there's no other way actually to weather the crisis apart from that. So I think we shouldn't worry too much about that.
Okay. The next question is in a way similar, but moving region to Ukraine. So I guess for you, Vasily, your views on Ukraine's standby arrangement. What are the chances of further fund dispersals with the current constitutional crisis? I mean, you've been looking at Ukraine for a long time. This is a repeated issue, I think, with Ukraine. You know, will the next dispersal come? Yeah. Is it different this time? Or?
Well, in the case of Ukraine, yeah, it is. Well, Ukraine has been, I think Ukraine has, I don't know how many IMF programs did it have since independence. I think more than 10, something like 12, something like this. So having an IMF support for Ukraine, this is normality. They are always on support from the Ukraine, but only a few of these programs were actually completed. So most of them were adopted, and at some point maybe there was the first tranche, sometimes the second tranche, and then there was always disagreement about some conditionalities. So there were always, of course, conditionalities attached, and many of these conditionalities are still problematic in Ukraine. And now, you know, there is this constitutional crisis because of the issue surrounding corruption. Yeah, when the Constitutional Court basically declared that this electronic declaration of incomes by state officials is illegal, which is basically against the efforts of the authorities over the past few years, at least to show that they're fighting corruption, because this is an important prerequisite for getting the IMF money. So there will be certainly some difficult moments for Ukraine, and I think until the very end, they will not know whether they will get the money or not. But I would like to stress one thing, that politically, I think it is very important for the West to support Ukraine economically. Yeah. So I think it is a narrow line for the West, and I think the IMF here can be seen as part of the West. It is very important to go a thin line. On the one hand, they need really or they ask for reforms, and they cannot just give money to Ukraine without any conditionalities, because then there will be never any reforms implemented. That's the problem. But on the other hand, they cannot withdraw support completely either, because if they withdraw the support from Ukraine, then there will be a big economic crisis in Ukraine, and this will play into the hands of Russia, which is for the West this is not what is optimal for the West given the geopolitical rivalry. So yes, my projection, my personal opinion is that in the end, the IMF will help Ukraine sooner or later, even if there will be difficult negotiations involved. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'm conscious that we're now well over an hour, but we still have quite a few questions. So we'll try to get through as many as we can. The next one is from Alessandro about nearshoring, which I think is a topic that everybody's talking about. It's a very interesting topic at the moment. Branimir is still here, I think. Now, Branimir is leading currently a project for us on nearshoring potential in the Western Balkans, which is one of the regions where there's particular attention to this. So maybe, Branimir, you want to say something first, and then Vasily and I can maybe add something more on the other regions if we see something.
I think you're not hearing me, or?
Yes,
okay,
now
you can hear me. Okay, I mean, good. So there are some, let's say, indications that something like that might happen, and people have been talking about this for some time. I would mention the latest UNCTAD report from several months ago, from some time ago. I'm not sure exactly how long it was, but from this year, which said that after this crisis, we can expect more nearshoring, in the sense multinational corporations will bring their investment from Asia closer to their, let's say, homes, which means usually Europe or Eastern European countries. I'm not sure that I can't say that we are still seeing some numbers about that. It's very hard to say for the moment. But what we can see for now is that the FDI in the region is not declining, or has not declined so much during this crisis. That might be taken as some first early warning, or early sign that there might be some nearshoring going on currently or in the future. But I would take that with some grain of salt. I think that in some months, after, let's say, this second wave ends, we will have a clearer picture. Like Richard said, we are currently doing research on this issue. We are talking to companies, both in, let's say, Western Europe and working in the Balkans, about this thing, and we will have the results from the survey very soon. We'll probably publish that study in the next coming months, and then we'll have clearer picture. But for now, I can say that there are some indications that we might expect something like that, but I wouldn't take it for granted. Let's wait a bit, and we'll have a clearer picture.
Thank you. Vasily, do you want, I mean, for the CIS in Ukraine, I guess we would be relatively skeptical about this. I mean, do you see any positive possibilities here for the region?
Well, less so, I would say, for the CIS, and Ukraine maybe less so, but maybe a few words about the car industry, yeah? The prospects of the car industry in Central Europe, so in countries like Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, but also probably Serbia or North Macedonia. So there were, or some time ago, there were serious concerns whether countries such as, for instance, Czech Republic or Slovakia will be able to retain their niche as a place where cars can be cheaply produced, yeah, because of the growing competition from the Western Balkans, because of the growing competition also from Turkey. There were some projects, there was a project, or there was an announcement of a potential car plant in Turkey. And then, Richard, please correct me if I'm wrong, this plan was cancelled, and this was before the pandemic. So that was good news for Central European countries. Also, their position in terms of production of electric cars and hybrid cars is maybe not as bad as one might think. So actually, there have been some production lines, for instance, in Hungary, in Slovakia, and in Hungary, they are also making steps into this direction. So yes, I think now in general, if you take all the factors into consideration, also these potential for nearshoring, or these concerns over too much reliance on Asia and on China, all these factors, I think, speak rather in favor of or make the prospects for more investments in the Central European countries more favorable, also in the car industry, I think.
Thanks. This leads nicely on in a way to the next question, which is about Visegrad and the outlook for those economies, and how for all three of the four, so not Slovakia, but the other three have become more negative. And actually, we have our Slovakia expert, but also our car expert, Doris, here. So maybe we could, Ronnie, you could bring in Doris, please, because I think Doris can say something about the automotive sector, but also about the Slovakia case, which I think is actually pretty interesting in a way. You know, Slovakia is this extreme open economy that was definitely buffeted a lot in the second quarter, but Slovakia actually looks a little bit better than we thought in the spring, which is interesting. So maybe we start with this, the prospects for the automotive industry, following on from what Vasily said, and whether there's some nearshoring potential there and the resilience of that, but then also what's going on in Slovakia as well would be interesting, I think. I can see that Doris is here, so she will be with us imminently. And then after that, we will go. We also have Sándor, our Hungary expert, who already wrote a little bit in the chat. But Sándor, you could also say something, I think, about Hungary as well. So I think Doris is here, but I cannot hear her. Hopefully this will work out. Maybe Vasily, for now, you could show the revisions chart again, which shows, I mean, in general, a positive picture for the EU member states relative to last time. So pretty much all of the EU member states seem to have handled this pandemic much better than we thought in economic terms, with, as the question rightly says, with the exception of most of the Visegrad countries where the revision is to the downside. Seems we're having trouble getting Doris here, but maybe we can try then with Sándor first to talk about Hungary.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Sándor. Okay, great. Let's start with Hungary. Hello.
So I try to answer the question, what was the reason of the downward revision of the forecast? So actually, it's related tightly with the deterioration of the pandemic in Hungary. The second wave seems to be more serious than the first one, and the original expectation that there will be a V-type recovery in the third quarter, and from that on, a normalization of the economic activities was too optimistic. Actually, the third quarter data will be published tomorrow, but they will be perhaps still relatively good, but the fourth quarter will be again quite negative. And I recall also that the first quarter of the next year will still be quite weak in terms of economic growth. So the recovery may come in the remaining 3 quarters of 2021. So one reason is the pandemic. Another reason is the suboptimal management of the crisis in medical sense and also in economic sense. Fiscal measures were relatively modest in Hungary to curb the negative impact of the crisis. The aggregate demand fell strongly. Constructions like shortwave were far from being really generous. So consumption, investment declined strongly, and recovery is not really in sight yet. I would mention another problem, which is a more or less a Visegrad problem, except Slovakia and the Czech Republic. It's a problem for Hungary and Poland, that the resources from the recovery and reconciliation funds are very important to give a boost to the economy next year. And for these countries, there is a certain danger that the conditionality to the rule of law may be a serious problem and may delay or reduce the available sums, which would be decisively important for recovery. And in Hungary, additionally, there will be parliamentary elections in 2022, in early 2022. So the government, Orban government, will need this external support for recovery of the economy. And then at the same time, it will be difficult to fulfill the requests coming from this conditionality. So there will be a very interesting developments to wait in the next months in this respect, and most probably for Poland as well.
Thank you, Sandor. Very interesting. There's quite a bad echo on. Maybe you turn off your microphone, Sandor. It's okay now. I think it's very interesting because you've introduced a lot of themes which are relevant for the Visegrad in general, I think. Maybe with Slovakia being somewhat of an exception, but this region which seemed in public health terms to do a really good job in the first wave. Vasily showed the chart with this really exponential line for Poland of new cases, but it's very much the same, I think, in the Czech Republic as well. And I think also this point about fiscal policy is very important, and that maybe they haven't actually handled it that well in Hungary on the fiscal side, because if you look at not the changes, but the estimates that we have for 2020, actually looks a lot better for Poland than for Hungary. And I would guess, I think that most likely that is fiscal policy. Poland is a country which has attacked this, in fiscal terms pretty aggressively. And it sounds like from what you're saying that Hungary hasn't, and that's maybe another reason for the rather poor growth performance. We have another question. I'm conscious to get through all the questions, or try to get through all the questions. We have a question which is very important from Natasha on actually there were two. I think I missed the first one. I'll go to the first one first, from Natasha, on the assumptions about the vaccine and other medical solution, when it will be available and how that is part of the forecast. Vasily, you already mentioned this briefly, but maybe you can say a bit more on that.
Yeah, well, yes, our baseline scenario assumes that the vaccine will be, let's say, available for the large parts of the population by the middle of next year, approximately. So basically our assumption is that the first half of next year, or in particular the winter, of course, first of all, the winter months may not be good. Yeah, so it is probable that there will be another lockdown after Christmas. Yeah, given the weather conditions, which of course also plays a role. But by spring, or maybe by the middle of next year, there will be a vaccine which will be increasingly implemented. We know now, for instance, there has been an announcement in Austria, at least the official announcement, that official projections that first it will be the risk groups which will be vaccinated, so aged people and people with chronic conditions, and then it will become available to the broader segments of the population which are not part of the risk group. So this and this is still a pessimistic, this is still an optimistic scenario. So we think that in this scenario, the first few months of next year will be difficult, but then spring may be better, and in particular, the second half of the next year will be already good. And these projections that we have, these are of course projections for the year as a whole. This already reflects basically an average of the bad or of the relatively bad expectations for the first half of the year and good expectations for the second half of the year.
Okay, thanks, Vasily. So I saw that Doris happily managed to answer the question on the automotive industry in the chat. So thank you, Doris, for that. There was also a question on Kosovo, which was answered in the chat. So I think we need to bring this to a close now. We've been going for almost an hour and a half. But let's finish with the final question, which was also from Natasha, which I think is a good way to finish, which is, I lost it now, sorry. What important structural changes will come as a result of the coronavirus crisis? So thinking a bit beyond this immediate term outlook, I think it's a very interesting question, a very good one to finish with. What are the structural changes that will come about as a result of this crisis?
Yeah, well, basically the structural challenges that are facing the region, they still exist. So there were certain challenges which existed before the pandemic, and these challenges did not go away. So we also did some research, or actually quite a lot of research on that. And we think that, well, of course, for the less developed countries, for the CIS, for the poorer West Balkan countries, of course, their task is, I think, to attract more FDI and to try to replicate the success or the growth path of Central European countries. That would be already a big success for them. And some countries have already reported some achievements in that. So if you take Serbia or North Macedonia, there have been certain success in that. But we also see certain structural problems for the more advanced countries. So even for the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary. So these countries which did very well over the past decades to attract foreign direct investment, and it really helped them a lot to restructure their economies. They in particular also to lay the foundations for competitive export capacities, which are very important for them, yeah, which also helps them to avoid the balance of payment problems. But we see certain disadvantages in their current position, in their current patterns of specialization, because basically they are, if you look at the regional and global value chains, these are the countries that are specializing in those parts of value chains which generate relatively little value added. So for instance, if you take the car industry, if you take the electronics industry, these countries are part of global value chains, but they are specializing in production. And the most value added is generated not really in the production process, but it is in the headquarters, it is in R&D, marketing, so actually in the very much also in the services which accompany the actual production process. And most of these parts of the value chains would generate more value added. They are still located in Western Europe, in Germany, in the Netherlands. So this is a challenge also for countries, for instance, such as Czech Republic or Slovakia, whether they can converge in terms of per capita incomes with Western Europe, unless they do more, unless they specialize in for instance, in R&D, yeah, or in this type of activities. So this is a long-term structural challenge. It exists independently of the coronavirus pandemic. So this problem will not go away. I think what can be the outcome of this pandemic, that is pretty conceivable is that there will be a push for more digitalization. Yeah, this is plausible, and there is a lot of potential for that in these countries, basically. So they still have a rather long way to go, most of them, in terms of digitalization. Yeah. Maybe Richard can also add something to this question.
Well, I mean, I think you covered most of it. I mean, I was thinking this for a paper I had to write recently, like what is truly new about this crisis that can really cause structural change? And I think there are lots of things you could think about. I mean, the supply shock was pretty new in Q2, but as we've established, it's been unwound. I'm not personally very convinced about this nearshoring story as a game changer. I think the new, whatever new FDI comes back from Asia will tend to go to places that already get a lot of FDI anyway in manufacturing. So as a game changer, I'm not really sure. I think this hit to tourism is very important. That is definitely new about this crisis. But you know, if we have a vaccine and if the pandemic goes away, tourism will bounce back very quickly, I think. And so that leaves me with more or less the same conclusion as Vasily, is digitalization. I think that is the game changer here. That is what has fundamentally changed in this crisis. We, in a few weeks, in March and April, we moved a third to a half of the economy online throughout Europe, basically. It is unprecedented change in the digital economy, but how not in the ICT sector, in the whole economy, the digitalization of the whole economy. And I think that it's very speculative at the moment, but that matters hugely. I think, you know, the economic geography of Europe over the last 30 years, the defining characteristic has been proximity to Germany. That's been the most important thing. And if we're really going to have a much more online economy than in the past, and I think we are, then I'm not sure that it matters so much anymore, the proximity to Germany. And that, for me, is where the real, not nearshoring and manufacturing in the old industries, but that, for me, this digital world, that is really where the opportunities for Central and Eastern Europe are in this crisis, if indeed there are opportunities. And that is where the structural changes, like I said, it's very speculative, but my sense is that is what is really different and new and important about this crisis. So those are my closing thoughts. We're past an hour and a half. We're going to stop here. Thank you very much for coming. It's great to have such a high attendance. We're really happy about that. We really value your questions and your input. Please download the presentation. Please download the report. If you have further questions, please feel free to follow up by email. That's no problem. I would like to say thank you very much to Vasily for this great presentation and for answering all these questions. It's the second time today. He already did the whole thing in German this morning. It's very tiring, and neither of these are his native languages. So thank you very much, Vasily, for this huge effort. Thank you to the country experts as well for contributing, those who spoke in the chat. This was, I think, also very valuable. We will have our next forecast in the spring. March probably. We'll let you know about that. We hope the news will be better then, and we look forward to seeing you then, certainly. And until then, stay safe over the winter, and yeah, we hope to see you in the spring. So goodbye.